Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Erica Cartmill. She's professor of cognitive science, anthropology, and animal behavior at Indiana University. She studies the acquisition and evolution of human language, and she is particularly interested in whether gestures play the role in the origins of human language. And today we're going to talk a lot about the evolution of gestures and human language, of course. So, Dr. Cartmill, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. I really appreciate your inviting me on. I'm very excited to talk with you and all of your listeners.
Great. So let's start with gestures then. And I guess that since we're doing this from an evolutionary perspective mostly, do we know how old are gestures from an evolutionary perspective?
Yeah. So it's a great question. I think it's a little bit tricky to answer because we see gestures widely across the animal kingdom. So, I think in terms of a type of communication, it's kind of like asking how old is vocalization, right? Lots of animals vocalize, dogs bark, crows caw, et cetera, et cetera. All of those involve vibrations of the vocal cords. And similarly, lots of different animal species use their bodies to communicate, right? So birds will raise wings, sometimes in elaborate displays. Some, blue-footed boobies, like the ones in the Galapagos Island, will raise one foot at a time in a little dance to sort of show off my foot, show off my other foot. You could call those gestures. They're bodily movements that communicate with other animals. However, the things that humans and other apes are doing seem to go one step beyond that. So we're using our hands in our arms and to some extent also our bodies and our faces to communicate in very flexible, very intentional ways. And I know we'll get into that in a little bit later. I just wanted to sort of say that, like, in terms of bodily communication, that's something that you see everywhere. When we talk specifically about the origin of human language and human gestures, that's where we want to think about what do we see in the other great apes. Humans are a great ape. We also have chimpanzees and bonobos and gorillas and orangutans, and all of those species also use gesture, and they gesture in ways that are very similar in some important ways to humans. I know we're going to talk more about that, so I don't want to sort of give everything away at the start, but that human-like gesture, the sort of roots of human-like gesture, I think are at least 12 or 13 million years old, because that's how long ago the lineage that resulted in modern orangutans um, diverged from the lineage that resulted in modern humans. And so since we see these same qualities of gesture across all of the great apes, we can infer that our last common ancestor also had those same properties of gesture.
So we're focusing here mostly on great apes, right?
That's what I do in
Orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos, hominins, right?
Yeah, so that's what my work focuses on. There are people
Yeah.
who study gesture in other animals, and I think it's a really interesting question of, are their gestures different from the gestures we see in great apes and in humans? I think I can speak sort of from an expert perspective about the great apes. I can sort of, maybe be a sort of general consumer, like, plus a little bit if we're talking about gestures in, birds and fish.
No, but one of the aspects that you mentioned there that I find very interesting, and that is, it's basically an important clarification, is the fact that animals can actually gesture with different parts of their bodies and not just the arms, the hands, or the fingers. Because when we colloquially talk about gestures, I guess that what people are usually thinking about is what you do mainly with your hands, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So I think when we're talking about human gesture, people are typically thinking about the hands.
Yeah.
Even gesture researchers who, sort of think broadly about gesture. If you are designing a logo for a gesture conference or a gesture lab, it's always hands, right? I mean, we're
Yeah.
like hands, hands, hands. We make a lot of hand jokes, oh, let me go out on a limb or hand it to you, or right. So, like, oh, there was the evidence points to this, right? I mean, there are a lot of hand jokes. But but humans also gesture with all different parts of their body. So you think about, if I'm holding a cup of coffee and you ask me where something is, if I'm holding something, I might use my head to suggest where it is. I'll be like, oh, it's over there. I might use my chin to point. I might use my head to tilt. I might use my elbow. There are also some beautiful work that shows that people with limb differences, say you're born missing arms or you had an accident, people will can use their feet in ways that are very similar to their hands. And so I think that the spontaneous sort of most like first point of articulation, the plan A, I guess, when it comes to human gesture is to use your hands. But gesture, I think, is not something that's limited to the hands. I think gesture is a compulsion. It's something that we want to do. We want to communicate with our bodies. And if your hands aren't available, you'll use other parts of your body.
So let's perhaps take just a small step back, just for me to ask you an even more basic question. So, what are gestures then? What counts as a gesture exactly? Because it's not just moving one of your limbs or your body in a particular way, right? I mean, it entails some sort of communication, at least, right?
Absolutely. And I think this is where actually people who study humans and people who study non-human great apes uh, tend to have slightly different definitions. And I think that's just because it's harder when you're studying an animal of a different species. It's harder to make inferences about their behavior. It's harder to understand it. In a way, you're on the outside looking in, right? And so when you see another human communicating, you have stronger intuitions about what they're doing. And oftentimes that's good. Sometimes you have to like check your intuitions and say maybe they're doing something else. But often we use those intuitions as scientists to sort of start our inquiry. So this is just a point where sort of my two hats, because I work on gesture and great apes, but also gesture and humans, and so I have to sort of say like, well, which hat am I wearing right now?
Well,
Um,
we're also a great ape, right?
right, and yes, thank you for bringing that up, because I certainly I use the term great apes to mean non-human great apes
No, no, I get it. I
usually.
get it.
Yeah, just because it gets a little wordy as a mouthful. But that's absolutely right and really important to emphasize. Humans are a great ape. And, that's why it's not surprising when we see commonalities between us and other great apes. But in a way, we're also the most distinctive great ape. We sort of have what other apes have, but then we have a bunch of other weird stuff on top of that. And so just to come back to your question about what defines a gesture, if you're, I would say there's sort of broad agreement about kind of an area of things, but then specific definitions really differ from study to study. So, for example, some human gesture researchers define gesture as movements of the hand and arm that are used in communication with other people. So they occur during conversation, during interaction. They're communicative in nature, and their movements of the hand and arm. Other people expand that to include the upper body. Other people might only use the hands and arm and face. Other people include any part of the body as long as it's used in a communicative manner with another person. And so, but not all gesture happens during communication. And so that's where it gets tricky, because I think what started as something, as a topic for people to study this additional part of communication. It's not just speech, it's also we're doing all these things with our bodies. How does that communicate? Why are we doing it? Does it have specific forms? Does it vary culturally? All of these things are very rich questions that people have tackled about gesture. But sort of once people started studying gesture, you realize it doesn't always happen in conversation. If you're thinking through a complicated math problem, you will sometimes use your hands to visualize things for yourself. So gesture can also be things that and it isn't just math. I mean, if you're thinking about, I'm sure any of your viewers, if they're like, okay, I'm going to close my eyes and I'm going to think about how I get from, my house to my office or my house to my school, right? And it's like, okay, I'm going to go here, I'm going to turn, there's this intersection. All right. And your gestures might be small. They're not showy. They're not, trying to reach someone in the distance, but nevertheless, the things that you do with your hands can really help your recall. They can help your memory. They can help they can help you externalize things in the same way that if you were writing something on a piece of paper. And so, so yes, gestures are communicative, but at least in humans, they don't have to be. And so in human gesture research, there's a really interesting divide between talking about gestures as communication and gestures as cognition. And so even when you're communicating with another person, a lot of the gestures that speakers are doing are helping them talk. And so there's really interesting work where if I realize I've sort of gone off on a tangent, I apologize. I will finish up soon, I promise. But if
Also,
you,
you're giving away some of our
oh
later
no, all right,
questions. But no
okay,
worries.
I'll stop. Anyway, I'll try to limit myself to the questions you ask. I just get excited and then I'm like, oh, I'm gesturing. Oh, that reminds me of something else. All right, I will limit myself, but to come back to your actual question you asked about what is a gesture, I think it really depends on whether you're studying human gesture or you're studying ape gesture. Human gesture allows for the possibility that gestures can be for the person who is gesturing, right? That like it's helping me think, it's helping me reason, it's helping me talk. It's also helping you understand, but a lot of the things that I'm doing with my hands are for me, not just for you. With apes, we don't sort of allow that possibility, and that's because we can't study those, or it's not that we can't. It's very difficult to ask those questions about whether gestures are helping apes think. It's much easier to ask, it's still difficult, but it's much easier to ask whether gestures are helping apes communicate with others. So with ape gesture, we're looking at really a small subset of all of the things they do with their hands. So they have to be, and I will not jump ahead, but we're looking for intentional movements that are done to communicate with another individual. So if I produce a movement and maybe I'm waving my hand and I'm doing it to you in an interaction, say a greeting. You don't see this in apes, but I'm just giving a human example. I mean, you do see it, but not as a greeting in this way. Sorry, it's too many things. Anyway, if I do something that's directed towards you, and then I do the movement on my own later on, as a gesture researcher studying apes, we don't include that in our data because we're not confident that it's intending to communicate with another individual. A human researcher would definitely include it.
So just to clarify one aspect here, since we're addressing these from an evolutionary perspective, and I guess that phylogenetically speaking, these would be relevant. So when you talk about human gestures, are you referring exclusively to Homo sapiens or also to the rest of the Homo genus? And if so, are you interested in other hominins and even hominins that came prior to the Homo genus? I mean, from Homo erectus forward or not?
Yeah. That's a great question. I mean, I'm certainly interested. It's very hard to say what our earlier ancestors in the human lineage did.
Right,
I'm specifically talking about modern humans, about Homo
right.
sapiens. Um, it's very possible, and I would say likely, that some of the features that are unique to human gesture today were also present in earlier Homo species, but that they evolved after the lineage that evolved into humans split from the lineages that evolved into the other great apes. However, it's very hard to date when those changes might have occurred.
Mhm.
So I think that there are certainly features of gesture there are features of human gesture that I think could not have been possible until humans had a much more representational, sort of illustrative mind. And I think that there's evidence for that kind of mind in cave art, in early carvings, in the things that we typically think may be markers of language. Those are
Yes.
certainly, I think, also markers of the kind of complicated gestures you see today. The hard thing is saying how much earlier would human-like gesture have evolved.
Yeah, I guess that what you just mentioned there already points to another aspect that we might come back to later on in our conversation, but that is the fact that the gestures we use do not depend exclusively on the kinds of things that your anatomy allows you to do. I mean, the kinds of movements that we can do with our fingers, hands, and so on, but also with our own cognition, right? I mean, perhaps there are gestures that we can do because we can cognitively process specific kinds of information, and perhaps if other animals would have hands like ours, maybe they wouldn't produce the same gestures due to some cognitive limitations. Is that it?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and I think do you want me to answer that now or do you want to come back to that?
No, no, answer that now, yes. And then perhaps it
Okay.
will have other implications to some other things we might talk about later. Yeah.
Okay, good. I learned my lesson though. So so I think that one of the reasons that ape gesture is such an interesting topic. I mean, I think it's many reasons it's an interesting topic, but one of the reasons is that ape gestural communication seems to be much closer to human gesture than ape vocalization is to human speech.
Mhm.
And and in experiments very far away from what apes are doing naturally. But if you take a chimpanzee and you raise them in close contact with humans and you try to teach them speech and you try to teach them a manual communication system like a modified version of American Sign Language, they'll learn a lot of the sign language, they won't learn the speech. And that is really a physiological limitation, right? That we know that their minds can acquire symbols, they can acquire keyboard symbols, they can acquire manual symbols, but they have limitations in their vocal learning, right? Apes are not vocal learners. Humans are really the only primate that has vocal learning, where we can hear a new word and pronounce it immediately. Apes can do that with their hands, and their hands are remarkably similar to humans. If you see a picture of a bonobo hand or an orangutan hand and a human hand, they're a little bit weird. Parts get stretched or squished, but they're very similar. And yes, humans have greater control, greater dexterity over their hands, but they move in largely similar ways. And
Okay.
so, apes can learn something like American Sign Language. They do it in a kind of, in a not fully sort of, articulated way. It would be like, if you had a speech impediment and you were learning English or
Mhm. Yeah, and
Portuguese,
not
right?
in a fluent way then. Right.
Right. So I just mean in terms of their like pronunciation, if they're
Mhm.
doing
Yeah, yeah.
if they're
Okay.
doing a sign, like girl, right? They might do, instead of extending the thumb and dragging it down, they might just do their whole hand like this,
Okay.
right? And so the sort of articulation, especially of like different fingers in specific ways, is sloppy, basically.
Mhm.
Um, but they're still able to learn and produce signs. So it's not that the manual limit the physiological limitations of the hand are not what's preventing them from learning fluent sign language. It's what's preventing them from pronouncing the signs correctly. But you can be a fluent speaker who has a pronounced lisp, for example. And if apes had human-like minds, they could do that, right? They could be fluent signers who, just had pronunciation difficulties. But nevertheless, they were putting together, sentences and telling stories. They're not doing that. So yes, there are some physiological limitations in terms of how exactly precise the movements can be, but I think it's really the cognitive limitations that are preventing them from using a full form of human language with all of the complex grammars, and even the kind of desires to communicate certain things, to tell stories, to tell jokes. These are things that humans do everywhere in the world, no matter what language you speak. No matter sort of once you get to be sort of close to adult like. The question that I'm really interested in is like, what do very young children do, because they aren't yet fluent speakers, and so can we see some of those urges, those communicative urges? Do 2-year-olds want to tell stories? Because apes, even when they get even when they acquire the communication system of a 2-year-old, don't want to tell stories in the same way. And so I think that's a really interesting question that's fundamentally more about cognition than it is about physiology or biology.
So another question now, how do we know whether ape gestures are intentional or not?
Yeah. So the ape gesture community, starting with Mike Tomasello and Joseph Call,
Mhm.
borrowed and then modified a set of criteria from researchers who were studying very young human infants. Because you can ask the same question about young human infants. If a baby goes, ah, right? How do you know that, like, are those movements meaningful? Are they trying to tell you something, or are they just, gassy or uncomfortable or something? And so, in looking at any being, including young children, where you can't ask them what they mean. You have to try to figure out other ways of measuring their intentions. And so this set of criteria, at least the modified version that we've adapted, I include myself in the we, although I was not part of those original studies. We, the gestural community, have adapted for apes, is that we look for movements that are, first, we call non-effective. And so that means that the movement doesn't achieve its own goal. So if I want someone to move away, if I shove them, it's not a gesture, it's an action. I'm pushing them out of my way. But if I tap them or I poke them or I touch them gently, then that would be something that is, where the movement is communicative rather than, where it's communicating my goal rather than doing the goal directly. So first, they have to be non-effective. They also need to be directed towards another individual. And I already talked a little bit about that, right? That ape gestures, we really only look at things that are communicating to another individual rather than things that I might do by myself. And that's where it differs from human gesture. So non-effective, directed, and then we start to look for evidence that the ape has a goal in mind in their communication. And so we do that in a couple of different ways. We look for evidence that when there isn't a response, the ape continues their communication. So we look for persistence. So if I do something, say I want you to move and I poke you and you don't acknowledge me, do I persist in communicating, right? That's good evidence that you have a communicative goal, or the ape has a communicative goal, and it hasn't yet been met, right? So I keep doing stuff. The interesting part, I think, is not about, do I keep communicating? Right? I mean, my dog keeps communicating a lot when the mail person is delivering mail, but she just does it in the same way over and over and over and over and over. um, and I'm like, shut up. Right? She's lovely. I love her so much. She's the light of my life. But she's, kind of doing this. She's like, look, 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 look. Right? And what we're trying to look for in apes is that they're not just repeating the same thing over and over, but that they're also elaborating, or exaggerating or changing their signal, right? So if I want you to move and I poke you and you don't move, I might poke you again, repetition, but then I might change to something else. So, I might like tap you to get your attention, or I might like, vocalize as well. Or I might move, if you're not looking, I might move around in front of you and then do something. I might try pulling you. I might lean on you and then tap you, and kind of throw other things into the mix. So we look for evidence of elaboration, of persistence and elaboration. And then in that example I just gave, where I might move around in front, that's another thing that we look for is sensitivity to the signal being received or being able to be received. So again, we do this in a couple of different ways. One is we look for evidence that the apes are using potential gestures in modalities that are accessible to the recipient. So if the recipient is not looking, right? If your back is turned to me, I am not going to come up behind you and go, shoo, right? You can't see me. So if you're looking, I might do a shoe gesture. But if you're not looking, I'm either going to use a vocalization, which we don't count as a gesture, or I could use what we call an auditory gesture. So I could clap, or I could, tap, the thing you're sitting on, or something else. Or I use a tactile gesture, like a poke to get your attention, or a tap, or I nudge you. Um, and and when apes can't be seen by their recipient, they'll either use tactile or auditory gestures, or they'll often walk around where they can be seen and then use a visual gesture. So I think that sensitivity to when they can and can't be seen, and adjusting their communication, is another thing that we use as evidence of intentionality. And then the last thing is we also use evidence that apes are expecting a response. So we typically, the word we use to describe this is response waiting. It's not like the most exciting term, but if I produce a gesture, say I want you to give me something and I hold my hand out. If you don't, I will produce the gesture, but I'll wait. And so you can do that either with a movement final hold. So I can produce the gesture and then hold my hand there and wait for you to respond. Or I can gesture and then still stay looking at you and wait for something to happen. And that's very different you know, from going, hey, 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 and not checking to see if there's a response. And so, I think that the kinds of things that we see sometimes in the animal kingdom, oftentimes signals that we call broadcast signals. A bird goes up on top of a tree and they're like, I'm singing, I'm singing, I'm singing, I'm singing. They're just putting stuff out there, right? I mean, it's like tweeting, right? Literally. Right? Where you're like, I'm putting stuff out there. Maybe people will hear it, maybe they won't. But you're not producing a signal and then waiting.
Yeah.
Producing a signal and then waiting. And some you do see that sometimes in other kinds of animal signals. So I'm not saying that's only in gesture, but that's just a piece of the puzzle, is that you're producing a movement and then you're waiting to see how the other will respond. And I think that's, again, kind of providing evidence that what they're doing, the movements that they're doing are intended to communicate. They have a specific goal, and they're anticipating a particular response.
Well, I don't know about other non-human primates or apes, but I guess that if you repeat a gesture without waiting for a response, at least in humans, you might have the intention of annoying the other person. So it might be still intentional.
That's very fair. Actually, that's one of the things we're looking at in this new project I'm working on teasing. So I do think that this exactly where you're like, hey, hey, hey. So yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and then in 10 seconds, the other person will turn around and say, "You're annoying me." Yeah, so another aspect of gestures here. So when it comes again to apes, how flexible are their gestures?
So I would say I mean, medium flexible. I think we think that they're more flexible than their vocalizations. I would say they're less flexible than human gesture. So there do seem to be, there are certain kinds of gestures that apes use to communicate different kinds of goals. So there are kinds of gestures that apes use to initiate play with others. There's certain kinds of gestures that apes use um, to display, maybe to threaten or to like seem big and show off. Um, However, we do see those gestures also in other contexts, and that's important too, that if you only have if you have a gesture that you always use in just one context, always in the same way, it's very hard to say that you have any control over it, right?
Yeah.
It's more likely to be something that's quite reflexive, right? If
Mhm.
it's like oh, every time, I see Molly, she's my friend, right? So like every time I see Molly, I go, hi, Molly, right? And I don't ever do anything different. And I never do this gesture in any other context. It's very difficult to argue without the ability to interview someone that like this gesture is intentional, that it's something that I have control over. And that's fundamentally what intentional is about, right? And so I think that this question of flexibility is very important. So I would say yes, ape gestures are flexible. Um, but I don't think I think that they probably don't have as well, from what we see, they don't have as much flexibility as over their gestures as humans do. But they do seem to have gesture forms, so arm raises, arm extensions, tapping things, poking, and they use those gestures, those underlying forms of gestures across a wide variety of contexts, and they
Mhm.
modify them and combine them with other forms of gesture in many different ways.
So when you mentioned their gestures being reflexive and so the individual who produces them not having particular control over them, does that have anything to do with the gestures being innate or learned or not at all?
Yeah. Let me just clarify. I don't think that ape gestures are reflexive.
Sure, sure.
So yeah. So I just wanted to be clear that I do think ape gestures are intentional. They're not
Mhm.
reflexes,
Okay.
but some animal signals, you look at sort of a classic example of like the Darwin's like digger wasp, right? And you have these examples of say insects who like will do the same behavior over and over as long as no matter how many times they've done it before, as long as you put the right stimulus in front of them. And that's sort of what I mean by like a reflex, right?
Mhm.
Something where if you have the form, if you sort of put the command into the computer system, it produces the signal without thinking. And
Yeah.
I don't think that's what apes are doing. But it's an interesting question about biology, right? About what's inherited and what's learned.
Yeah.
And so ape gesture is a really tricky um, sort of topic in this area because the forms of ape gestures seem to be very similar across different groups of apes. They're very similar across species of apes, including us. So humans do a lot of other fancy things, but we also seem to have this kind of core set of movements that are used by all of the great apes. We extend our arms with our palms up to request things. We throw our arms away from our body to get others to go away. We like clap and tap and wave to get attention. And so I think one great question is that similarity in form due to a common biology,
Mhm.
either within a species or also between species? Or is it due to similarities in body forms, right? You have like 10 things that can wiggle on two things that can wiggle more on two things that can like stretch out and come towards your body, but they can only do those in a certain number of ways.
Yeah.
And so, is it that the sort of similarities in physiology are driving the similarities in the form of the communication system? Or is it, that we have inherited forms, we, the great apes, all great apes, have inherited forms of gestures? Or could it also be something to do with similar social needs? And this, I think, is a little bit harder to explain across species, but I think is a nice way to potentially explain similarities across groups of the same species. So if you're in a chimpanzee group and you're in a zoo in Belgium compared to a chimpanzee group in the wild in Uganda, you still have multiple males, multiple females. You have juveniles, you probably have babies want to be picked up, other females want to like play with or interact with babies, you have to communicate, so there are sort of a set of social goals. I want stuff, I want you to go away, I want you to look at me. So that set of social goals might sort of common social goals might lead communication systems to be more similar than we would expect just in a random number generator. Um, but I think that's probably not the reason that great apes have sort of similar forms of gestures. A lot of the movements that they're producing look similar. I think that there's probably biology involved. I don't know whether all I mean, I do not think that all forms of great ape gesture are biologically inherited. um and so it might be that it's sort of a constraint of the body plus a certain, maybe an underlying like movements away from the body or to push other individuals away,
Mhm.
movements towards the body or to bring them towards, and then those kind of get mapped onto similar physiological forms, and so
Yeah.
you see common forms of gestures.
Mhm.
That's a really big question. I think no one has a great answer for it. There are different, there are lots of different. Well, not a lot. There are a few different theories about how apes acquire their gestures. I, perhaps in a sort of political slash theoretically weak position, think that ape gestures are not all acquired via the same mechanism. I think that some gestures are probably socially learned, some are probably biologically inherited, some are probably ritualized down from effective actions. And so, just I don't know if we're going to talk about that later, but just quickly, ritualized means sort of something that started out as an effective movement, like I'm, pull you towards me, and that over time, you start as the recipient of that action. You start to realize what I'm trying to do, and you start to respond earlier and earlier and
Mhm.
earlier. And so what started out as I grab you and pull you, or put my arm around you and pull you, then turns into something that goes from to to to. right? And so, and then the final movement, it can be something that's just like, come with me,
Mhm.
right? Which is very different from, all right, I gotta take you and go over here. Um, the problem is that that's a very difficult process to observe because it happens over many interactions over a lot of time,
Yeah.
and that's something that we believe is important in the gestures of some of the gestures of human children, as well as some of the gestures of great apes. And so I think that ape gestures are acquired via a diversity of mechanisms. But one final thing, and then I promise I will be quiet about this, is that um, it seems like the forms of gestures are very similar across species and across groups of the same species in different locations who've never met each
Mhm.
other. But it seems like the uses of gesture differ much more than the forms. So you might have, the same shooing gesture, but in one group it tends to get combined with these other signals or tends to get used in these contexts. And in another group, it manifests, it's used in different ways. So I do think that there's more evidence that learning, whether it's social learning or individual learning, I'm not sure. But I think that learning and potentially culture plays a bigger role in the use of ape gesture than it does in determining the physical forms.
And do ape gestures have specific meanings? And by the way, what is meaning in this context exactly?
What is meaning? How many
Yeah.
hours do we have? um, so I think so. I mean, yes, I think ape gestures. I think some ape gestures have specific meanings. I think
Okay.
some the meaning is very flexible and it so just in the way that if we have if I say, do human words have meanings, and you say absolutely, and I say, okay, well, like if you take the words um I mean, I don't know, like storm, right? Like it can be like a physical storm. It can also refer to someone's mood. It can also refer, right? So you
Mhm.
can have things that, yes, there is sort of like there is a meaning, but it really differs, based on the context, exactly what it means. And you can use it in non-literal ways. And lots of human words don't have don't have very tight meanings,
Mhm.
right? So I mean, like deictic words, I can say here and there, and like the, those are really like, yes, they mean things, absolutely, but what exactly they mean really depends on the context.
Mhm.
And I think that the same is probably true of ape gesture. And now I am not saying that ape gestures are the same as words. Just want to be really clear. But um, they're similar in the way that, or I guess what I'm talking about is that they have sort of a primary meaning that you think about, where it's like, yes, this gesture is used to initiate play, or this gesture is used to get someone to follow you. But
Mhm.
they also sometimes get used in other contexts, or they might have sort of have a loose, like, this is a play adjacent, like this is a play gesture, but it gets used in different ways within the context of play.
Mhm.
um and so I think for example, I'll just well, I guess I could just offer you my coffee cup, right? So like if I am offering you something, right? And I love how whenever I'm being an ape, I have to like get down. But if I'm offering you something as an ape, I don't know why it's like um, then
Do they have shorter necks or
I
what?
don't know. I think it's just my like, ooh, I'm acting now. um, so sorry. But it's just how you like tell I'm switching into like, oh, I'm being the ape. Yes. So I give you, so let's say I'm offering you something. Sometimes, I mean, that can have many different meanings. Yes,
Mhm.
it can be take it, but it can also be look at what I have. I could pull it back. I could be disingenuous. Um, I could be offering you something, because I want to get rid of it. I could be offering you something because it's a high value item and I want you to mate with me. I could be offering you something because I want you to see the thing I just got and I'm not going to give it to you. And so, I think that yes, ape gestures have meanings, but I think they're not, they're not always constrained in like meaning
Mhm.
exactly the same thing each time.
Okay.
I also think, and just really quickly, I just want to say that just because I like wrote a whole paper about this recently, and so it's a particular bugbear of mine,
Yeah.
is that um, the ways that we study meaning in animal communication are so different from the ways that we study it in human language that I think, basically, in order to demonstrate that an animal signal has meaning, whether it's a vocalization or a gesture, we're looking for evidence in order to prove, yes,
Mhm.
this thing has meaning. We are often looking for evidence that it has a reliable response, right? So the animal does this, the signaler does this, the recipient, the signaler does A, the recipient does B. We want the recipient to do B a bunch of times in order to argue that A has the meaning, request B, right?
Yeah.
The problem with that is that then we conclude that animal signals are very inflexible. We argue that like, oh, animal signals are very different from language because they have this simple code system where I use this signal and it always gets this response. But that's also the way that we're structuring our questions. It's what we're looking for. And so I get very irritated, not at you, you're wonderful, but at this like idea that, that animal communication is fundamentally different from human communication because it has this one-to-one correspondence between what the signaler does and what the recipient does, when most of our studies have been designed specifically to look for that. And so I'm not saying that it's impossible that animal communication is like that, but I think that the way that we're asking questions about animals affords those types of answers and really excludes the possibility that they're using them in much more flexible, creative, um, you know, human-like ways.
So the last thing that you just mentioned there, I was actually earlier when I was about to interrupt you, I was going to ask you, and I guess that you've already answered the question, but just to see if you have anything else to add to it. But I was going to ask you actually how you go about distinguishing a gesture that has no meaning from a gesture with a specific meaning.
Yeah. So with, I mean, with non-human great apes,
Yeah.
um, it's hard to argue that gestures have no meaning because I mean, there's certainly gestures where we're saying like we don't know what the meaning is. Um, and there are gestures where we say we're pretty confident we know what this means. Um, it's harder for us to sort of call something to like conclude that something is a gesture if we don't have any evidence that it means something.
Yeah.
um, just because it's hard to ask, and again, this is I think where the human gesture researchers and the ape gesture researchers would differ in terms of like human gesture researchers would say like it's a movement, it happens while you're talking with other individuals, it's a gesture. With apes we don't have that luxury, right? They're not engaged in conversation, like the gesture is the conversation, and so in a way you have to say, well, what are they communicating in order to argue that the movement they're doing is a gesture? So I mean, the intentionality criteria that I talked about are not about meaning. So at least that's really nice. It's clean. We can say, it's not effective, it's directed, they're repeating, they're elaborating. But um, but sometimes it's tricky for us to sort of say like this is clearly its own gesture when we don't have evidence that it's communicating something in particular. And so that's where I think this like we just need to be uh transparent about the fact that the ways we're studying ape gesture and human gesture are very different, and there are researchers who are trying to work around that, and really trying. It's harder to study apes in the same way that you study humans, but there are people who are trying now to study humans in the way that we study apes, and I think when you do that, you see many more similarities than than differences. But in terms of how do you differentiate between a gesture that has a clear meaning and a gesture that has, I won't say no meaning, I'll say a less clear meaning. um,
Okay.
it is you want to look for kind of a match between what the recipient is doing and when the signaler stops gesturing, right? So if I like poke you and you don't do anything, and I poke you, you don't do anything, and I poke you, and then you move away, and then I stop communicating, that's like one data point that suggests that the poke is the goal, and thus the meaning of the poke is to move,
Mhm.
right? The same thing if I'm doing a like, a beckon, right? I'm like, come here, come here, come here. And we try to, as ape researchers, we try to not like gloss things as, oh, it means come here, right? You want to build that evidence up from the bottom up. And so, we see this arm swing towards the body, and another individual comes over, and then the ape stops producing that signal and stops communicating. Maybe they switch to grooming, maybe they do something else, but we use the sort of what the recipient does that makes the signaler stop communicating as evidence of meaning.
Mhm.
And it's important that it isn't just once, right? So and that's that, because like you do it once, it could be, like you were saying, if I poke you a bunch and you turn around to yell at me, it's
Yeah.
like, get the heck off, right? Like that's probably not the meaning of the
Uh,
gesture.
yeah.
And so it's important that, as researchers, we gather lots and lots of examples and we look across them to see like what across many examples, what are the most frequent behaviors that cause the signaler to stop signaling. And then, for some gestures, 95% of the time it'll be the same thing. And we think about those as gestures that have very tight or very strong meanings, right? This
Mhm.
gesture is used to get this thing to happen. Sometimes it doesn't happen. The other individual ignores them or goes away or whatever. But when there is a response that causes them to stop, it's almost always this thing. Other gestures are used much more flexibly. And so maybe, 20% of the time the other individual goes away, 20% of the time they come towards you, 20% of the time they start grooming, 5% of the time they share an object with you, 5% of the time it initiates mating, so there are gestures that seem to have much more flexible meanings, and that they
Mhm.
result in a lot of different outcomes
Yeah.
that sort of satisfy or apparently satisfy the signaler.
Well, I guess that perhaps you people who study gestures in non-human apes should be a little bit more ambitious, and when you teach them sign language, you should also try to teach them philosophy, and then you would be able to ask them directly if their gestures have any meaning or not.
Ah, why didn't I think of that?
Yeah, even
Yeah.
though perhaps it would later on raise some ethical questions, because if you teach them philosophy, they might start to think about their own existence, and then start to feel existential dread and think about death and all of that, which would ruin their mental health.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so let's get now a little bit into language then. So, in what ways do gestures relate to language? I mean, are there features of gestures that are shared with human language, for example?
Yeah, so when you say gestures there, do you want me to talk about the ways in which ape gesture might be similar to human language, or do you want me to talk about human gestures and how they like are an integrative part of language?
Let's go with ape gestures. Yeah, I'm
Okay,
more interested here in the phylogenetic aspect of this, I
gotcha.
guess.
Cool. Yeah, because I mean, uh, to answer the thing you didn't ask, um, just to say, I do think that human gesture is very much part of human language. So I think
Okay.
that speech and gesture together are really like part of a multimodal system that manifests in different ways where like speech, has particular rules and is much more digital, gesture is much more analog, it is, more holistic, it's more imagistic, and I think that those systems coming together is actually like part of what makes human language very powerful and very different as a system.
Yeah.
Um, but in terms of similarities between ape gestures and human language, so I think there's much more evidence that apes combine gestures together. They don't seem to do it according to syntactic rules. So,
Yeah.
so I mean, no one has found evidence of that. If they did, it would be a Nature paper. It'd be very exciting. um, but they combine gestures together in sequences, and those sequences tend to show, like I said, persistence and elaboration, things like
Mhm.
that. But but they're not isolated signals. I think in that way that those are sort of more language like.
Mhm.
And they are very flexible, and I think that that's really the part where the thing that attracts a lot of people to study gesture is that they seem to be able to use them in ways to overcome communicative hurdles, right? So an early experiment I did looked at the ways in which captive apes, again, we sort of, I've been talking about like apes in general, but there are people that study apes in captivity and people that study them in the wild, and their gestures seem to be pretty similar, but their social needs, their social structures, and the kinds of things that they communicate about seems to be very, I mean, well, not seems to be, is very different, right? You have
Yeah.
animals that are trying to survive, and you have animals that are sitting around being fed, basically like watching television and poking each other, which I would argue is much more like modern humans. But we're all sort of thrown in together and just finding ways to occupy our time.
Yeah.
Anyway, so what was your actual question? Sorry, that image just like blanked
Uh,
out my
no, sure, no worries. It was if whether there are aspects or features of
oh yeah, gesture and language.
not primate but ape gestures and human language that they share. Yeah.
Absolutely. Um, Yeah, so right, so I talked a little bit about flexibility.
Mhm.
They seem to combine them in potentially interesting ways. So one of the first experiments that I did was looking at how apes communicate when they've sort of met their communicative, or sorry, how they communicate when uh, a human experimenter appears to misunderstand versus only partially understand. And so in this experiment, we had the experimenter give the apes either part of the thing that they were requesting or give them the wrong thing. And then we wanted to see what apes did in response. And we found different patterns in how they gestured and how they tried to communicate. And they weren't vocalizing. Sometimes they were making noises with their mouths. They were
Yeah.
like blowing raspberries or kind of smacking their lips, but mostly they were gesturing, either with auditory gestures or visual gestures. We don't usually have tactile gestures between apes and zookeepers. That can be problematic. Um, so in this case, we found that in these two very different situations where they're either getting the thing they're not getting anything they want. So it's like they're requesting a banana and they get an onion versus they request the banana and they get a little piece of the banana. We found that the kind of the patterns of their communication were very different following getting an onion and getting a little piece of a banana. And so even though there doesn't seem to be any syntactic structure, there's still strategic combination, right? They're using their signals in strategic ways to overcome miscommunication. And I think that that's sort of an interesting suggestion that there might be a range of different sort of strategic pathways to have
Mhm.
communicative complexity that isn't just syntax. So, the sort of syntactic rules that we see in human language are amazing. I mean, they allow us to take this finite number of things and communicate about an infinite number of possibilities, right? By combining them in different ways, like a Rubik's Cube. Um, Apes don't seem to have that, but they nevertheless seem to be able to use a limited number of gestures, a limited number of movements, and they're able to combine those to communicate, with other individuals in novel situations to achieve their social goals. Those social goals are more limited than humans, right? We're not like they're not trying to build universities, teach each other recipes, make up bedtime stories, but but they're still able to achieve their social goals in oftentimes um, quite flexible ways that involve combining different signals, paying attention to what the recipient understands and doesn't understand, right? Do
Mhm.
you are did you get me? Did you sort of get me? And whether the other individual is paying attention. So I think that this like social monitoring of the other individual, the potential for theory of mind, which we haven't talked about, but I do think is sort of there in the background with ape gesture. What do I know about your mind? Do you understand me? Do you know
Mhm.
that I'm trying to communicate to you? Do I know that you know that I'm trying to communicate, right? It's all of those kinds of you can go on and on and on. But
Mhm.
but fundamentally, it's what do I understand about your mind? And I think that apes are different from humans, but I think they're a lot closer than people used to think. Um,
Okay.
I do think that they understand something about intentions. They understand something about others' goals. They understand things about what surprises other individuals, and they can use that to their benefit, for good or for evil. Right? They can like manipulate other individuals, but they can also console and be quite empathetic. And I mean, just as humans can. And so I think, this is a way in which humans are kind of a supercharged primate. We really think a lot about other individuals. That's why we have soap operas, right? We spend a lot of time and we're fascinated by like what other individuals want, what they're doing, what they're thinking. Like humans as a species are like a supercharged ape. And I think what's interesting is to look at the other apes and figure out the ways in which um, we see commonalities in the sort of basic forms of our cognition, but also our communication.
And so, to go back to one of the points we made early in our conversation, when I asked you, or basically I mentioned that probably gestures are not used simply to convey information to others, but also to aid one's own cognition. So, in what ways can our usage of gestures aid our own cognition?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's so many we could talk for that an hour, for an hour. I mean, a lot of um, so there are several theories about this in
Yeah.
terms of why gesture might aid our cognition, but
Mhm.
I can just sort of talk for a minute or two about like the different areas in which we think it does.
Okay.
Um, so gesture certainly helps speech. It helps you speak more fluently. It helps you it helps you have fewer pauses, helps you have fewer ums and uhs. So there's some, really, really nice experiments that show that when you restrict people's gesturing, so like if I sat on my hands, I mean, I could do this, live on your show, but I'm not going to because I like gesturing. But if you restrict your gesturing, you'll make more mistakes in speech. You'll pause more. You'll go uh, you'll have more disfluencies, and a disfluency is what I just did. I said you'll have more disfluencies, right? And so it's like I start and then I start a different thing, or I say half a word and then I erase it. So gesturing helps you speak more smoothly. It helps you speak more coherently. It helps you remember words. If you're like, I'm
Yeah.
thinking of this word and I can't remember it, and I'm like, and you see this kind of like, oh, I'm sorting through things gesture. People do that a lot. One of the best ways to think about whether gesture helps speaker fluency is to look at people gesturing when they're on the telephone. And so, and when they can't be seen, right? I am clearly, if I am on the phone and I am talking to someone and, we're not using FaceTime or Zoom, my gestures are not for you. But what's fascinating is that those gestures actually are sort of for you because they make my speech better. They make it, I make more sense. My speech is smoother. It doesn't have as many pauses. It has more like musicality, right? And so the ways in which gesture sort of integrates with and supports speech can be present even if you can't see my gestures. And I think that's really fascinating. So that's about sort of gesture as part of communication, even when you can't see the gestures. And I think the aid to communication there is both for the person who's communicating, but also for the other person. And then I think there's a whole body of work that looks at how gestures can help learners. So they can help while you're learning something. They can help you when you're processing that information. They can help you remember things. And so there's a whole body of work looking at gestures in educational contexts. And that's both learning from the gestures of others. So how do children learn from teachers' gestures? And, it seems to be it's quite important. And so there's a lot of, there are interventions where people are, changing the ways in which teachers use gesture as a visual aid and seeing does that in what context does that help children learn more than not getting gestures or getting some visual aid that isn't gesture?
Right.
And that most of that research is in math education. And then there's also research that looks at how the gestures that children are producing. It's usually children. Just I think sort of the majority of educational research is on children, but it's also true of adult learners. How do the gestures that learners themselves are producing? How does that help? How does that help them learn? And and I think that initial work in that area really showed that the ways in which children are gesturing can provide insight about where they are in their learning process. So there's a beautiful set of studies by Susan Golden Meadow and her colleagues that look at what are called Piagetian conservation tasks. They're like Piaget was a famous scientist who had developed these tasks. So there are cases where children's gestures will differ from like what you see children gesturing about will differ from what they say in speech. And so when that happens, children's gestures tend to be right, and even when their speech is wrong. And so what's really interesting is that children who are in this space where their hands are saying one thing and their mouth is saying something else, those children are more sort of ready to learn. They're like almost figuring it out, but they don't realize it. And so that is actually a great way to get insight about, when learners are like about to get something, maybe that's a point where you could give them some additional support. You could intervene in a way that would help get them to there. So in one conservation task, there's two rows of little stones or markers, and then one, and then the experimenter spreads one of them out, and then you
Mhm.
ask the child which one has more, right? And children will like, below a certain age, they'll, even though they have the same number of stones, because they're longer, children will say, this row has more. And if you have a whole group of children, all of whom say that one has more, if you look at children's hands, they're actually split into two groups. So some children will take their finger and they'll go, that one
Yeah.
has more. And you're like, wait, but you just counted them. And you match them up one to one, one to one, one to one. And that's how you solve the task. But children's hands figure that out before their mouths do. And what's interesting is that those hands can help. I think the possibility is that your hands can help your brain figure out things that then you communicate to your mouth. And
Mhm.
so I realize it's a very simplistic way of saying that, but I think that this is true. You can see that in your own life where you're thinking, or I certainly can, I gesture a lot, as you can tell, but where I will oftentimes be thinking about something and I'll kind of, put ideas out and move them around or think about them. And sometimes I look at my hands and I go, oh, right. And it's like, yeah, I think, and it's like I'm trying to work something out. And then by doing the action and by seeing the action, I then get new insight into it. And so this is something that manifests itself in many different ways in conversation, but also in different kinds of learning or practice.
Well, you mentioned Susan Golden Meadow, and I'm actually about to interview her soon. So
Yay, Susan is amazing. She's
yeah,
the best.
about her book, Thinking with Your Hands. So I guess that we'll get more into these kinds of questions. So I have two more questions for you today. Then the first one is, how do you look at the future of gesture research? I mean, what kinds of questions would you like to see tackled or answered?
Yeah. I mean, I would love to see, and I think I alluded to this a little bit earlier with, talking about the um sort of, do ape gestures have meanings? I mean, I would really love to see sort of a, I don't want to say breaking away from, but an opening up of the way that people think about meaning, that we ask questions about meaning. Um, in non-human animals broadly, but in ape gesture specifically to me, because that's the area I work in. And I think we've for so long been trying to look for, one ape does something, another ape responds, A to B, A to B, A to B. And that's great. It's really important fundamental work. But if we're also really interested in flexibility, we need to kind of expand out from that, to think about the rare cases, to think about the things we can't explain. And I think in some ways the stuff we can't explain, which oftentimes we just say, well, we excluded these other things because oh, it's too complicated, three-party interactions,
Yeah.
or cases where you use a gesture out of context and you're like, but isn't that part of the day, right? And I mean, I do this myself. I'm not trying to say that like other people are doing bad work. I think all the work has been really important to building up a science of
Yeah.
ape gesture. But I think now that we have a science, I think it frees us up to ask potentially, harder questions, that break away from simple A to B structures. I'm
Mhm.
really excited about that possibility. I think it's really important. One of the things I would love to look at personally, and I hope others will look at, is are things about non-literal gesture. And in particular, play. I'm very interested in communicative play. So how, and we have always looked at gestures that initiate play, but we never think about the gestures themselves as being play. So that's something that we know is incredibly important in humans. It's, especially important in human children and we often are comparing the gestural systems of human children because they don't yet know language to ape the gestures of great apes, who
Mhm.
also don't know language but aren't going to learn language. And um, so what we see in human children is they use gestures in many creative, spontaneous, playful, non-serious, weird ways. They also use them in many serious ways. But right now I'm interested in what happens outside of the predictable.
Mhm.
And that's something that's been really hard for us to look at in ape communication, because we've been trying to prove that there are predictable, interesting ways, right? We've been trying to say ape gesture is a thing. Yes, it has meanings. Yes, it has intentional meanings. Yes, but now that we've said that, hopefully, I think we can kind of take it for granted and start to look at the things that are not part of that expected structural intentional system, which I think might lead us to some more interesting insights about how apes might be learning, might be playing, might be uh, communicating with one another in unexpected ways, and might be even using gesture to think in addition to communicate.
So does that connect to your project on whether apes have humor or not?
In a little bit, I think, and yeah, and I mean, thanks for bringing that up. I know that's sort of like my new project that's just
Yeah.
coming out now. So potentially, I mean, I haven't yet done the thing that, I want to do with looking at communicative play, but this project on playful teasing,
Yeah.
sort of, humor adjacent. I try not to use the word humor just because it's a very loaded term, and I think people have a lot of intuitions about what it means. And so I try to
And
use
it
like
it might offend comedians, but
exactly. Everyone's worried that AI is coming for their jobs, and the comedians will be like,
yeah,
the apes are coming for yours, buddy. So um I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, but
yeah,
I do think that looking at playful teasing and sort of joking behavior in great apes, is is a space where we can look for more flexibility. We can kind of build on some of the things that we've done in Ape Gesture, and that's actually where I started with the project, was to take gestural coding systems and apply them to interactions that, you know, weren't necessarily gestural.
mhm.
To take the criteria of intentionality, looking for repetition and persistence and directed behavior, but then sort of broaden that and look for sort of we created other criteria and things that we were looking for as well, but to focus on interactions where one ape seemed to be provoking another, but in a playful way. And so I was really focusing on the playful side of teasing rather than the
Yeah,
aggressive and bullying side of teasing. And that's something where I think the cognition underlying those interactions might be very illuminating about what one ape understands about another ape's mind. So, do they understand what's going to be surprising to them? Do they understand what's going to push them too far? Do they understand what they're going to, what's going to get a rise out of them? Um, and and I think that teasing is a really interesting area because it's kind of dangerous, right? It's in this gray area between being nice and being mean.
yeah.
And you absolutely can have mean teasing. I think it's very important to be clear about that. I'm not saying all teasing is nice, but teasing when it happens in a close relationship, like the teasing between a parent and an infant, or the teasing that happens in flirting, for example, or between close friends, those kinds of teasing, can tell you a lot about the social relationships. And it can also be potentially, and this is what I argue in our new work, it can be an opportunity to learn about the strength of your relationship with that other individual, and also potentially to build that relationship and to strengthen it. And so yeah, I think this is something where it's not I'm not specifically looking at gestures within teasing, but I'm very interested in looking at teasing as its own behavior, um, as a site to study the social cognition of great apes and potentially other species. I mean, my whole goal in this new project was to kind of argue that playful teasing was a thing, that teasing wasn't always bad, and that it is its own behavior that's different from play and different from aggressive teasing. And that I think hopefully more people will become interested in, and we can get more data about what other apes are doing, about what other species are doing, about what humans are doing in societies around the world, and hopefully to develop a sort of serious science of a non-serious behavior.
Great. So hopefully this will also serve as a teaser to our future second interview to talk more about this point.
Very, very happy. It's been really a delight talking with you.
So yeah, so just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Absolutely. I am not on what used to be Twitter. Although I probably should be, but maybe I will do that in the future. You can always look for my last name is weird, so you can always look for me. Um, I'm just moved to Indiana University, so I haven't gotten my lab website up and running yet. But if you look for my name in Indiana, you'll find my lab website by the time this comes out. And hopefully we'll also have some new social media along with that as well. And one thing I just do before we end is um, separate from my lab, I also co-run with my husband the Diverse Intelligences Summer Institute. And so that's something I would love people to check out. So we run a summer institute for 3 weeks every year in Scotland. And you can check our website out at disi.org.
Great. So, Dr. Cartmill, thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. It's been really fun to talk to you.
Thank you so much. I've really appreciated it. I had a great time, and yeah, I look forward to seeing more of your work, and hopefully talking again in the future.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantanti, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht, A special thanks to my producers Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Unic, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.